Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee for ICSS Sunday morning sessions. We are based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarx.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday morning sessions. Our session today is co-sponsored and being live streamed by the Critical Theory Workshop, 10:30 a.m. Pacific. Okay, hold on. Now I understand. Okay. Is co-sponsored by the Critical Theory Workshop. Our speaker is Gabriel Rockhill, editor of the recently released book, Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, and How It Can Be Reborn by Domenico Losordo from Monthly Review Press. Domenico Losordo, who lived between 1941 and 2018, was an Italian philosopher and militant who published over 50 books on Marxism, capitalism, Western philosophy, and the history of the communist movement. Gabriel Rockhill is a philosopher and activist who has published 9 books. He's a founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and a professor of philosophy at Villanova University. We will have a presentation by Professor Rockhill, followed by a short break for announcements, and then questions from our session participants and from the live stream. Welcome, Gabriel, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the presentation and the discussion that follows it. I thought that the best way to handle things would be to provide an outline of Western Marxism that operates at a slightly higher level of concrete abstraction than the book itself by Losordo, basically situating some of Losordo's work within broader debates on Western Marxism, including a book that I'm currently finishing for Monthly Review Press entitled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, that draws heavily on, is inspired by Losordo's work. I'll speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and as you mentioned, then we can have a break and open up for Q&A. I'll also mention, because we just started this morning with the Critical Theory Workshop. It's an educational nonprofit that I direct. We do a summer school, and we're increasingly doing activities throughout the year. We decided to launch a fall fundraiser to try to expand our activities and make more free educational kind of online content. So I just dropped that in the Zoom chat and the YouTube chat. If you're able to, and you have even the smallest amount, it would be greatly appreciated. So the starting point for today is I'd like to just get clear on a few of the basic concepts that I'll be using. The first is the understanding of the superstructure as Marx articulated it. In one of his most detailed descriptions, Marx wrote, quote, "In the social production of their existence, humans inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production, appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation or basis, on which arises," and this is his description of the superstructure, "a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social consciousness. The general process of the social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness," end quote. Now, the relationship between the socioeconomic infrastructure on the one hand and the ideological superstructure on the other, which includes both of these elements, the political legal aspect and what I'll call the kind of cultural apparatus. So the entire system of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. That relationship between the two is thoroughly dialectical, right? So Marx was not postulating a completely separate realm of economics that's not affected by forms of social consciousness, nor was he claiming that ideology has no internal logic of its own. Engels had to insist on these points later in life after Marx's death in order to avoid any confusion. In a famous letter to Franz Mehring on July 14th, 1893, Engels explained that ideology formally develops semi-autonomously and has a historical efficacy insofar as it may exert a reciprocal influence on its own environment and even upon its own causes, end quote. It is imperative, therefore, to avoid hypostasizing the infrastructure and the superstructure as two entities, approaching them from the point of view of what Hegel called the understanding, or more precisely, what Engels described as metaphysics. The infrastructure and the superstructure are complex, intertwined processes, which are only really assumed to be distinct and somehow separate elements due to our impoverished conceptual vocabulary. If one of these processes is identified as more foundational, or what Engels referred to as the determinant in the last instance, this is simply because it serves as the fundamental organizational structure of production and reproduction, meaning the overall economic mode of production, such as feudalism or capitalism, that conditions the material lives of human beings and their ideological composition. So, returning to the quote that I started with from Marx, we can see that the ideological superstructure, as I briefly mentioned, has two heuristically distinct elements: the political legal apparatus and what he calls forms of social consciousness, including religion, culture, philosophy, etc., of a particular society. This formulation, and others like it, has led to a very rich debate regarding how exactly this process of ideological composition operates and is related to the infrastructure. The work that I'm currently doing, drawing on Losordo's work, is an attempt to flesh out how best to understand the superstructure of the most developed imperialist countries in the world. This is important for framing Western Marxism because the best way of approaching Western Marxism is by recognizing that it is a superstructural or ideological product of the imperial core countries. So to understand it as a theoretical practice, we need to situate it within the international relations of production and of intellectual production more specifically. I'm using imperialism here in a very general sense to refer to the ways in which the capitalist mode of production has underdeveloped major parts of the world, primarily the global south, the continents of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, in order to develop the imperial core, Western Europe, the United States, and a whole series of annex countries, Canada, Australia, etc. What this means then is that we can talk more specifically about the imperial superstructure, meaning the superstructure that has arisen within the imperial core. Within that geographic region, and even as a geographic region, it's somewhat imprecise because it's more of a kind of economic mapping of space, if you will. There is a proclivity for bourgeois democracies as the principal form of political legal superstructure, meaning the best democracy that money can buy, or a democracy that functions not for the people, but for the capitalist ruling class or the bourgeoisie. And there's also a bourgeois cultural apparatus. Again, what I mean by this is the entire system of cultural production, dissemination, and consumption that is operative within the imperial core, and that core is driven by the leading imperialist country in the world today, which is the United States. So it's within this cultural apparatus of the imperial core that a very specific form of Marxism has developed. This form is referred to often as Western Marxism. I would myself prefer the term imperial Marxism because of everything that I've just said. There's a number of things that I'd like to highlight about this category in general before getting into some of the details. One of them is that the imperial superstructure, again, both the bourgeois states of the Western powers and their cultural systems have recognized that it is very difficult to defeat Marxism and to just simply eliminate it, because it is a powerful science of liberation, not only for human beings, but also for the planet in general. And it has served as a compass for revolutionary transformation around the world. In that regard, then, what we see in the history of the imperial core is the attempt to deal with an opponent that can't be defeated, the opponent being Marxism. And one of the options that has been taken, and this, again, I'll go into some detail in a little bit, but the capitalist ruling class has been very explicit about this. In particular, the Rockefeller interests, the Ford interests, the Carnegies, and the Mellons, as well as the bourgeois state, and in particular, the propaganda and disinformation agencies and the intelligence services of the bourgeois states, have recognized that if you can't defeat Marxism, the best thing to do is to try to produce a commodifiable version of it that guts it of its revolutionary core, disconnects it from actual political organizing, and makes it into one consumer product among many others. This, in many ways, is at least a preliminary definition of what Western Marxism is, right? So it's not a geographic description of all Marxism within, say, Western Europe and the United States. It's an attempt to identify a specific tradition of Marxism that comes out of the perversions of the imperial superstructure and an agenda on the part of the capitalist ruling class and their bourgeois state managers to turn Marxism into a consumer product that has exchange value within the academic world and with the kind of art and culture world, but does not really have use value to those who would like to not only interpret the world, but change it. So the reason I think that Losordo used the expression Western Marxism for this particular book, and that many other people use it, is because this became the standard term, particularly as of about the 1970s in European debates concerning splits within the Marxist heritage. One of the most famous examples of this is the work of Perry Anderson, who of course wrote 2 books about Western Marxism. Now, according to Anderson, the Western Marxist tradition emerged as what he calls a product of defeat, insofar as there was a failure on the part of the socialist revolutions of the early 20th century, particularly the Russian Revolution, to spread westward, which led to a situation, again, according to Anderson, in which the Marxists in the imperial core tended to turn away from Communist Party organizing and the analysis of political economy toward an investment in the academic world and a predilection for cultural and philosophic issues, right? This is one of the reasons that a lot of people also refer to Western Marxism as cultural Marxism, because it's a Marxism that doesn't so much analyze political economy or even geopolitics for that matter, as it focuses on cultural products, and in particular, the products of the bourgeoisie, so bourgeois culture. Adorno, of course, would be a canonical example, but there are many others. These characteristics that Anderson highlights regarding Western Marxism are, I think, true at a certain level of analysis. However, Anderson failed to situate the emergence of Western Marxism in relationship to the totality of social relations of intellectual production, as well as production more generally. By tracing the division between Western and Eastern Marxism back to what Lenin referred to as the split in the socialist movement around the First World War, which I'll explain in a moment, Domenico Losordo shed light on the socioeconomic underpinnings of this ideological divide. Western Marxism for Losordo emerged not as a product of defeat, as Anderson claims. Anderson, of course, is a Trotskyist. Western Marxism for Losordo emerged historically as a social chauvinist version of Marxism within the imperial core, which superciliously derided the anti-colonial Marxism of the East, right? So if you're familiar with Lenin's writings on the split in the history of the socialist movement, what Lenin was concerned with is at the time of World War I, within the social democratic movement, and of course, at that point in time, there wasn't a real distinction between the communists and the social democrats. So Lenin and Luxemburg and others were referred to and referred to themselves as social democrats. Within that movement, though, the leading communist parties within Europe, Germany in particular, align themselves on the agenda of the national bourgeoisies, supported the war effort. And against that, Lenin, Luxemburg, and others criticized them for being social chauvinists, for being chauvinists who are Eurocentric is perhaps the term that we would use today, or some people would use today, although I think chauvinist is much more explicit in that regard. And that this led to a fundamental split in which the social democrats of the European tradition ended up defending not only World War I, but ultimately the imperial interests and the colonial interests of the capitalist ruling class of their nation states over and against the position taken by Lenin and others who followed the same orientation. And that was a position that said that the class struggle in the age of imperialism has manifested itself in a principal contradiction, which is a national struggle for liberation from imperialism. So that the real Marxist position is not one of lining up and supporting the war and supporting imperialism. It is supporting the anti-imperialist struggle to break the chains of the Western powers and how they have subjugated the global South or the third world in favor of their own development. So what we see here in the divide between Perry Anderson's account and Losordo's account is obviously Anderson is a Trotskyist. Losordo is more of a Marxist-Leninist, not in the Trotskyist sense that that term sometimes takes on. And that in Anderson's account, you have a superstructural analysis in which he mainly looks at the political orientation of particular figures and how they're oriented in relationship to cultural struggles. But he does not provide us with an analysis of global imperialism, of the international relations of production. Losordo, on the contrary, has that as his fundamental starting point. It is therefore also, in my opinion, much more rigorously Marxist and much more rigorously materialist because he's looking at the economic mode of production and how it is fostering particular ideological orientations. He's not simply analyzing ideological orientations as if they functioned more or less autonomously in relationship to the economic base. In that regard, Losordo's approach centers the imperial system as the basis for understanding the divergence between the two traditions of Western and Eastern Marxism. I didn't mention this, but of course, Eastern Marxism is indexing a Marxism that puts Marxism into practice by using it as a science of liberation from global imperialism. So Eastern Marxism is the Marxism that was developed in the Soviet Union, in China, in Vietnam, in Laos, etc., in Korea, and many other places. It's not ultimately a geographic characterization either, though, because ultimately Eastern Marxism is simply indexing the form of Marxism that is quintessentially anti-imperialist and centers the struggle against imperialism as the most important struggle within the kind of geopolitical class struggle. In that regard, Losordo's work then provides us with at least an implicit call to engage in a political economy of the production, circulation, and consumption of ideology. Far from slipping into a form of economic reductionism, though, this project pays ample attention to the subjective agency of individual intellectuals. Anyone who's taken a look at the book should know that. He goes into specific positions taken by Horkheimer, Adorno, Agamben, Zizek, Hart, Negri, and many others, so-called Western Marxists. And I think this is very important to his project because there's a misunderstanding on the part of some that Marxists are economic reductionists or that there's a long-standing tradition of economic reductionism, in spite of the fact that just about every well-known Marxist worthy, at least of the name, has been critical very explicitly of economic reductionism. Lenin, perhaps first and foremost, but many others as well. And so Losordo's account is situating Western Marxism within the imperial superstructure that's driven by the base, while also analyzing in great detail the agency of those individual Western Marxists and the positions that they took. It's for this reason that I think that the best way of understanding, although he doesn't use this particular term, one of the things that Losordo is doing is that he's mapping an ideological field. And an ideological field like that of Western Marxism isn't made up of a set of theoretical principles that one follows based on one's ideals, or ideas for that matter. An ideological field approaches ideology from the point of view of practice and the material endeavor to or I should say the material forces that condition those practices. So an ideological field sets the kind of rules of the game, if you will. But within that game, there are many different ways of playing it. And so it allows for the agency of individual subjects, but that agency is conditioned by the parameters of the field as such, right? So one could think of playing a game, right? Like a soccer match for that matter. There are rules. And within those rules, though, there are many different ways of playing soccer. Just as within an ideological field, such as the ideological field of Western Marxism, one of the fundamental rules is anti-communism, meaning an opposition to actually existing socialism in almost every shape and form that it has taken in history. There are a few exceptions to this that we could touch on, just as within a game of soccer, there are people who bend or even break the rules. They might not be seen by a referee, etc., but the rules of the game nonetheless remain in place. And so I think what Losordo is giving us is a kind of map of the ideological field of Western Marxism. This is a very important point, I think, because for two reasons. One is that not all Western Marxists agree. Many of them have profound disagreements. Many of them have written books against one another or articles condemning, positions that others have taken. And it's also true that Western Marxism, because it's principally oriented towards the academic world and towards the bourgeois cultural apparatus, is driven by brand management, right? Eastern Marxism or anti-imperialist Marxism is driven by use value. Lenin was not trying to make a name for himself like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri and sell a lot of books and get invited to the US and become a famous professor. Lenin was looking to make a revolution and to do that collectively with other people. That's a very different orientation of one's theoretical practice than that of the academic Western Marxists who are primarily invested in exchange value. What that means is that the theoretical practice of Western Marxists is driven by an absolute attempt to differentiate one's discourse as being unique, singular, the first person to have thought something, a new idea of communism, a new idea of socialism, all of these that really have to do with a petty bourgeois theoretical practice of singularizing ideas instead of contributing to a collective project. And so this is one of the features that we already see. And it's also one of the reasons that the gatekeepers and the kind of satraps of the franchise will often say things like, well, how could you possibly think that Michael Hart and Antonio Negri and Alain Badiou and Zizek and, Perry Anderson and Jameson and all of these people who have taken different positions are actually all playing within the same ideological field. The reason that many people believe that is because they're hoodwinked into this primacy of individual theoretical production as if it was all singular and unique, which is a big part of the bourgeois ideology of art and culture. The genius who thinks beyond his or her time comes up with some ideas that are absolutely idiosyncratic, etc. Losordo, in approaching this from the point of view of an ideological field, understands full well that there's a material practice that is actually more or less identical on the part of all of these opportunist intellectuals. It's just the way in which that practice articulates itself is that it has to produce an idiosyncratic and absolutely singular product that can then compete in the marketplace of ideas. So there's an imperative to have new and different ideas, idiosyncratic vocabularies, etc., obscurantist language, special references, etc., so that you can have your own unique brand that's very different than anybody else's brand. And again, this is very different than someone who's participating in a collective project of elucidating and transforming the world. What this means then is that in many ways, Western Marxism is a consumer product of the imperial theory industry. It's a commodified version of Marxism that is spruced up with bourgeois cultural references. It is an ideological perversion, in my opinion, of the science of human liberation and of emancipation, for that matter, for other life forms and the planet. And in this regard, that has to be part of the critique of Western Marxism. One other thing that I'd like to add to these kind of opening definitions is that it's important to understand that Western Marxism is not just a product of the imperial superstructure. It is much more specifically a product of the intellectual labor aristocracy. I'm sure people are familiar with the term labor aristocracy, which Lenin used to describe the workers in the imperial core who, while they might very well be exploited in their labor relations within the capitalist core countries, they nonetheless occupy the very top of the global labor pyramid. So they have a very privileged relationship when you compare them to the workers in the colonial periphery and the semi-colonial periphery. That labor aristocracy, then, is one of the reasons, and one of the principal reasons, that Lenin diagnosed behind the split in the history of the global socialist movement. It's because the workers in the imperial core countries actually had a material interest in preserving imperialism and colonialism that they ideologically lined up on the bourgeoisies of their countries. And that's what was driving their ideology. In much the same way, this analysis can be applied to the intellectual world. And so the intellectual world that's developed within the imperial core has constructed institutions of higher learning and a broader cultural complex that is arguably the most developed in the world because of the underdevelopment of the global South to enhance the development of the imperial core. And the intellectuals who are Western Marxists, almost without exception, occupy the positions not just as members of the intellectual labor aristocracy, meaning the very top intellectual producers within the global pyramid of intellectual production, but within that, they tend to occupy the very, very top echelons of it, meaning that they have elite positions at prestigious universities and are invited around the world to capitalist junkets in order to fet and celebrate their work. All of this hopefully gives you a sense of the overall framing, both of Losordo's work, but then also some of the other debates on Western Marxism more generally. So what I'd like to turn to now is a little bit more of the kind of details concerning Western Marxism. As I mentioned, so the capitalist ruling class and the imperial superstructure have contributed to developing this commodified version of what is ultimately an anti-communist Marxism. It's an imperial Marxism that's called Western or sometimes cultural Marxism. And that this form of Western Marxism is severed, for the most part, from progressive, practical political struggles. And it significantly altered the fundamental tenets of Marxism in becoming little more than a consumer product for the imperial theory industry, meaning an ideologically infused commodity for the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core and their comprador allies in the periphery. This, I think, is the first and most important feature of Western Marxism, which includes the Frankfurt School, but also includes Operismo in Italy. It includes a lot of French theory, as well as many forms of Anglophone Marxism. Now, if we concretely abstract from some of these specific discourses in order to identify the overall ideological orientation, in spite of some partial exceptions that we could discuss, we can identify some general traits. To begin with, as a theoretical practice, Western Marxism is founded on the primacy of theory rather than the primacy of practice. Anderson is crystal clear about this. He says it explicitly. And Western Marxism generally shuns organized progressive politics, as I mentioned, but it also repudiates socialist states in favor of engaging in theoretical debates and the analysis of bourgeois cultural products. The point for the Western Marxists is not to change the world, it is to interpret it, or sometimes even just to interpret texts or other cultural products instead of having to deal with the real world. Their theoretical practice is oriented primarily toward exchange value, as I mentioned, in the sense that they're engaged in the symbolic economy of the academic world in the so-called marketplace of ideas. Methodologically, Western Marxists are revisionists who attempt to transform some of the fundamental tenets, as I mentioned a moment ago, of dialectical and historical materialism. This means that they generally reject the dialectics of nature, and they focus on cultural criticism at the expense of political economy. This severely limits the scope and depth of their analyses. And there's a widespread tendency to assume that culture and the world of ideas constitute the driving force of history, not class struggle. This idealism often goes hand in hand with utopian rather than scientific socialism. In other words, if they actually support socialism of any sort, Western Marxists support socialism in theory, not in practice. And it's usually their theory of socialism or their new idea of communism. The bourgeois idea that only art or culture can save us, not revolutionary class struggle, is one of the leitmotifs of this discourse. Unsurprisingly, given the inability of art to save us, another feature is their defeatism and left-wing melancholia. When they do try and identify a political exit to the quagmire of consumer capitalism, which they bemoan and often criticize, they generally indulge in a third-way politics of, it's a kind of classic petty bourgeois belief that there's a magical way beyond capitalism and actually existing socialism that has a course that's charted out by their own privileged ideas or concepts. Now, this can come in multiple different forms. In the case of someone like Badiou or Zizek, it tends to be messianic. So the idea of communism is an idea that transcends anything that socialism has ever incarnated in the real world. And what we really need to do is read and study them and try to understand an idea of communism that they have a lot of trouble articulating themselves. And when they do actually articulate it and give concrete, practical examples of communism, it is, according to Badiou himself, doesn't really look like communism at all. In fact, one of the examples that Badiou likes to refer to is Solidarność, the movement in Poland, which is a very complex movement, began as a workers' movement for reform within a communist state. But within about a year, the principal driving force behind Solidarność became the Central Intelligence Agency, and it became a weapon of war against the Eastern Bloc countries in general, and one that many of the French theorists, including Badiou, supported in an attempt to overthrow the Polish government. And so this obviously is an investment in anti-communism as the new idea of communism, which, you know, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that there's at least a mild contradiction in that regard. However, there are other Western Marxists who are less messianic and less idealist and Platonist than someone like Badiou, and they prefer the kind of terrestrial path. And what they tend to celebrate, Antonio Negri would be a good example of it. Zizek also traffics in this. There are many other examples. They tend to celebrate jacqueries and uprisings and moments of kind of intense conflagration. But they are opposed to disciplined forms of hierarchical organization and strategic planning that they identify and denigrate as being part of, you know, actually existing socialism. What this means then is that their defeatism is often a self-fulfilling prophecy. You'll never be able to change the world if you think this only requires a newfangled theory or you're waiting for divine intervention, nor will you ever succeed if you think that an unorganized, popular rebellion can magically win against highly organized, disciplined, and militarized imperialist states with extensive expertise in counterinsurgency, as well as the most powerful propaganda network in the history of humanity to back them up. So the specific ideological coordinates of Western Marxism include, as I mentioned, a rejection of actually existing socialism. Many Western Marxists are also opposed to organized revolutionary politics, including the party form, right? Badiou's very explicit about this. Party organizing is a form that is no longer appropriate to the contemporary age. It's not clear to me exactly why that's the case. He kind of declares it by philosophic fiat. And it's also a demonstration of the extent to which many Western Marxists are anarchists in Marxist clothing, meaning they're opposed to the party form, but they're also generally opposed to the seizure of state power. Which they see as being just one more form of control, very much in line with a kind of insurgent anarchist orientation. They often fall back on simplistic moralizing approaches that naively advocate for horizontalist democracy and critiques of all forms of domination, rather than thinking in politically strategic terms about how to how to structurally modify over the long term a society in order to make democracy truly universal. In this sense, they tend not to be strategic thinkers who recognize that the dialectics of socialism sometimes requires tactics that might appear to contradict the overall goal, but are the only way of really advancing socialism in the real world. Finally, if given the choice between communism and capitalism, Western Marxists practically side with the latter, with capitalists, over and against the former, the communists, with very few exceptions, and in spite of their criticisms of capitalism, some of which are very well founded, they are ultimately anti-communist, capitalist accommodationists. The overall effect, then, of Western Marxism has been the global promotion of a petty bourgeois cultural commodity with little use value for practical struggles over and against the collective and innovative science of liberation known as dialectical and historical materialism. Since the latter has proven its ability to practically transform the world by breaking the chains of imperialism, it is clearly, from the vantage point of the ruling class, the most dangerous theoretical weapon of class struggle. Because it has not been possible to eradicate it outright, there has thus been an explicit effort to cultivate this commodified version of Marxism that can spread the virus of anti-communism under the cover of a red-colored pill. This has produced an imperialist version of Marxism, an imperialist kind of industry even, of ineffective academic discourses that are promoted around the globe as the very vanguard of Marxist theory, but which, practically speaking, serve to misdirect, confuse, or simply alienate those in search of a rigorous theoretical guide to understanding and transforming the world. With the time remaining, I'd just like to do two final things. One is to briefly highlight three of the leitmotifs that I've touched on briefly, but I'd like to bring them to the fore of Western Marxism according to Losordo, and then briefly talk about the kind of counterforce to Western Marxism, which I'll describe as anti-imperialist Marxism, because ultimately it's not just Marxism of the East, but it's a Marxism that's invested in changing the world, not just interpreting it. Regarding Losordo's three leitmotifs, he refers to messianism, rebellionism, and populism. So messianism we talked about briefly. This is the idea that, well, if Marxism is going to have any traction in the world, it is to come from a force above and beyond the world. And it's incredible the extent to which so many of the Western Marxists, when you dig into their work, they're actually idealists who are invested in some type of otherworldly transcendent force that we have to be faithful to, bear witness to, etc., as that being the kind of compass of our struggles. So ultimately, they're not materialists. They're idealists, and this has been a long-standing, of course, enemy of the Marxist tradition. Rebellionism overlaps with some of what I was saying about the more terrestrial path of some of the Western Marxists. Antonio Negri is probably the most outspoken, or was, because he passed away in this regard. But again, Zizek takes positions that are very similar. As soon as there's an uprising of any sort, burning of buildings or vehicles, some type of popular mobilization, ideally relatively unorganized. So more of what Marx referred to as a riot than even an organized revolt. These Western Marxists tend to celebrate that as a rebellion against the system. And what's very important about that is that they tend to celebrate rebellionism as a form without actually asking the most important question. And that is the substance of the politics of the rebellion. Is it a rebellion against the imperialist system? Or is it a rebellion against the Cuban government or the Chinese government or historically against the Soviet government or against the Eastern Bloc? Because what rebellionism allows for is identifying the true enemy being the dominion of the state or of power in general. And there's no distinction made between whether or not the power of the state is in the hands of revolutionaries who have ousted, at least to some extent, the capitalist ruling class, or is it in the hands of the capitalist ruling class? What this means is that many of those who fetishize rebellionism were the first people to get on board with the US-backed Hong Kong protests, for instance, or other such insurgencies like the Bay of Tweets that occurred in Cuba, which was basically a psychological operation on the part of the US government in order to create a tweet storm to try to destabilize the Cuban government in the ongoing attempts to overthrow Cuba. One could, of course, refer to a whole series of other examples in this regard, but hopefully you see this fundamental problem. It's good to be rebellious against any form of power, including power held by socialist states. Hence the Western Marxists getting in bed very often with anti-communist endeavors. Populism is an interesting category that Losordo uses because populism is also this kind of belief in this rather nebulous form of an extra ideological subject that is going to drive history that's not a class-based subject, right? So if you're familiar with the work of Jacques Rancière, he calls this the demos. André Glucksmann called it la plebe. People have different words for this. It can just be called the people or the masses. They have their own idiosyncratic concepts, but the idea is that there is some group that is rather diffuse, that's not a class, that is the driving force behind history, and that we should support this kind of amorphous group in rising up and revolting against an established system. And so the problem with this is, just as you see on the part of the kind of enemy of rebellionism can be socialist states or capitalist states, because there's no distinction between them, because there's no analysis of the substantive political content of those states, you have the same problem at the level of the militant organizing that's being done. If it's simply an embrace of populism across the board, this can also be an embrace of fascist-style populism, of amorphous movements that themselves are actually shoring up the capitalist system, or for that matter, marshaling power against actually existing socialist states. So those are the three leitmotifs that you'll find in Losordo, if you're not familiar with the book yet, that I just wanted to kind of touch on and relate to some of the things that I said earlier. But my final comments will be, and this is very important, so I hope that people haven't been, haven't lost their energy in listening to the other things that I've outlined. The real purpose for being critical of Western Marxism is not to celebrate oneself and say, oh, I'm smarter than all of these people, or they were all wrong, or it's just a bunch of garbage, or other such things. The real reason is to diagnose a problem. You have to know the cure. And one of the most powerful things about the historical and dialectical materialist tradition is that if it's done well and done right, criticism is rooted in an understanding of material relations that has a very clear sense of what the cure to that problem is. And so the real force driving a book like Losordo's, and in my opinion, the best criticisms of Western Marxism, is an understanding of anti-imperialist Marxism. Anti-imperialist Marxism is precisely the Marxism that has not been supported by the intellectual labor aristocracy. It has not been promoted by the capitalist ruling class in their foundations. It has not been supported by the bourgeois state in their intelligence services. It has been demoted, and there has been an attempt to marginalize it, to crush it, and in certain instances to assassinate the people involved in it. It is the form of Marxism that is a real threat because it is invested in the primacy of practice, not in the primacy of theory. It's what Lenin, in his famous critique of the renegade Kautsky, referred to as a Marxism that preserves its revolutionary core. So this dialectical and historical materialist tradition is a tradition that includes not just historical materialism as a mode of analysis of human society, but also the dialectics of nature, which is absolutely essential for ecological struggles today, as the work of John Bellamy Foster and so many others have demonstrated. It's also an orientation that does not give primacy to cultural analysis, but engages in political economy and always understands culture as a product of and as nested within specific relations of production. In this regard, anti-imperialist Marxism gives us a real analysis of the social totality, not a partial analysis of the kind of cultural sector, or for that matter, only an analysis of human society and history, which is what you tend to find within the Western Marxist tradition. It's based on use value, not exchange value. So use value means that if you're a Marxist in this tradition, your goal should be to make a collective contribution, not to come up with some new idiosyncratic idea that's very obtuse and difficult to understand, but something that's useful, that people can latch onto, and a form of theory that, as Marx, of course, famously wrote, has power not because it grips the minds of the PMC, but because it can grip the minds of the masses, right? That's the orientation of anti-imperialist Marxism. It is also fundamentally opposed to various forms of reductivism, dogmatism, the kind of orthodox images that often people use to slander anti-imperialist Marxism. It's a Marxism dedicated to innovation, because in order to analyze and understand the world and intervene in order to change it, you need to constantly innovate, but not for its own sake. The goal of innovation is to develop practical tools that have use value and can advance the socialist project. In this regard, one of the reasons that innovation is particularly important is because anti-imperialist Marxists have understood the dialectics of socialism. That socialism doesn't come forth fully formed from the brain of Marx or from a text that someone interpreted correctly. It comes from the collective struggle of the masses of humanity. And in that regard, those struggles need to be, as much as possible, oriented so that you can harness the true power of people, but direct it against the real enemies. Lenin, of course, famously argued that, and in this regard, he agreed with one of Kautsky's claims, that for a revolution to be successful, you actually need bourgeois intellectuals. The reason that you need them is because workers who are subjected to the standard regimes of labor exploitation simply do not have the time, the training, the expertise, because they've been deprived of it. It's not because they're not capable of it. It's because they've been deprived of it by the system that they're within. Bourgeois intellectuals have been given very specific training, education, tools, time for research, etc., and they can develop scientific modes of analysis that are absolutely essential for guiding massive struggles. In that regard, you need, in Lenin's account, a class traders from what we would call today the kind of petty bourgeois intelligentsia, in order to contribute to these anti-imperialist struggles. And the figures within this tradition, of course, are obviously Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, Thomas Sankara, Che, Fidel Castro. I mean, these are kind of titans, of course, and I'm just using these names as stand-ins for, these are people who did incredible things because they were part of collective movements, right? None of them could have done any of what they did if they weren't organically connected to massive collective movements. In that regard, the practical orientation of anti-imperialist Marxism is based on an understanding of developing tactics for advancing socialism with a clear sense of the strategy, and an understanding that those tactics might, at certain points in time, contradict the strategy. And this is maybe the last point that I'd like to drive home, because it's something that I think that a lot of Western Marxists really don't get, is that many of them remain at the level of socialist consciousness that I would refer to, drawing on Mao's interpretation of Hegel, as sense perception. They think to themselves, well, I have an idea of socialism in my mind. And often that idea is an idea of a communism that would be very far in the future, where there'd be no state, there might not even be any work, there wouldn't be any exploitation. Some people say you just abolish money, everybody be free and equal, and everything be perfect. So it's this kind of ideal version of a future society. And then they look at a place like, Cuba or China or Poland or, any place that has historically been an actually existing socialist country. And they say, well, my sense perception of what I see doesn't map on to my idea of what it should be. And that means, in many ways, that they're simply remaining at a very low level of socialist consciousness. What the anti-imperialist Marxists have always been able to do is operate at a much higher level of socialist consciousness because they recognize that there are reasons for the discrepancy between what you see and your idea of what socialism should be. And the principal reason for that is the long, dark history of imperialism. We have never had anywhere in the world socialism set free. There's not a single example. So why would we assume that socialism should look like this textbook version of things or this idea that we have in our minds? Socialism exists in the real world. And in the real world, the only form of socialism that has been able to claw its way into existence is a socialism that's been constantly under the most brutal form of endless hybrid warfare on the part of imperialist powers, while at the same time inheriting all of the ills of capitalism and decades, but usually centuries, of capitalist underdevelopment, with, on top of that, a need to develop the productive forces as quickly as possible, otherwise you'll be crushed by the imperialists, and to do it without relying on colonialism and imperialism. This is a near impossible practical task. But the anti-imperialist Marxists, who recognize the quintessential way in which imperialism frames the very conditions of possibility of socialism, recognize that we need to understand what socialism in the real world looks like and not just remain at the level of sense perception where kind of what you see is what you get. So a much higher level of socialist consciousness is recognizing that, yes, we should actually expect that there will be perversions, contradictions, and difficulties within the socialist project. That is scientific analysis because it's not about developing something based on an idea or a blueprint. It's about developing something in the real world of imperialism. That much higher level of socialist consciousness means that you have to find ways within socialism of dealing with the complex contradictions of navigating an imperialist world. And the highest level of socialist consciousness, which the greatest anti-imperialist Marxists have always had, is that it's not just about understanding how difficult it is to implement socialism and to develop it in an imperialist world. The highest level is practical consciousness. It is learning the ways in which you can practically do this over time. And one of the most important lessons that I've learned from Losordo, and he touches on this in Western Marxism, but it's also in a number of his other books, some of which we're in the course of also trying to get translated and bring out. So if anybody wants to get involved in those projects, reach out to me, is that socialism is best understood as a practical process of learning. That's what socialism is. It is people practically learning from the mistakes, the contradictions, the setbacks of actually existing socialism in order to practically move it to the next level. And in doing that, it's often been necessary to use tactics for building socialism that might appear to contradict the strategy, right? So Lenin's new economic policy, in which he sought capitalist investment in the Soviet Union in order to develop the productive forces. Some Bolsheviks tore up their party card. They're like, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't communism. This is communist, this is turning us back into capitalists. Lenin was crystal clear. He said, look, to get to where we need to go, we need capitalist investment because we need to develop the productive forces. We didn't make that choice. The imperialist world imposed that choice on us. What we need to do is find practical solutions in order to do that in such a way that we don't revert to capitalism, but we develop socialism out of the capitalist and imperialist world. So the highest level of anti-imperialist Marxist consciousness is that practical consciousness. And it's that ultimately that we need to cultivate. The last thing that I'll say on this, and I think here we'll clearly see, and then we can open up for questions. I think in the live stream on YouTube, you can begin plugging questions directly into the chat, but then Alan, I'll turn it back over to you to moderate, is that we see here clearly the distinction between Perry Anderson's kind of Trotskyist framing of Western Marxism and Losordo's understanding of Western Marxism. One of the things that Perry Anderson did is he celebrated Western Marxism as the most innovative form of Marxism for one reason. That is its theoretical contributions. He says this very explicitly, as if the goal of Marxism was to develop new trendy forms of theory that he and his ilk at New Left Review, and which also has a publishing house that used to be called New Left Books and is now Verso Books, they can monetize and make money off of, because he's actually has a material interest in claiming that the goal of Marxism is theoretical innovation and not practical innovation, because it's increasing its market share, right? So you see that ideology is rooted in the economic base and driven by the economic base. And Losordo takes a very different position, and that is that the difference between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism isn't that Western Marxism developed all these innovative theoretical tools. It's that what we have in Eastern Marxism is a practical process of learning in which people did the impossible, which is they chartered unchartered territory. They helped humanity develop socialist forms that we might have criticisms of, that have setbacks, that are complicated, that have contradictions, but nonetheless are pushing the envelope because they are charting new territory by which human beings can introduce and further develop a socialist alternative to the absolute hellscape of the capitalist world. That should be the ultimate arbiter when we judge someone's theoretical contribution. Are you contributing innovative Marxist theory that is saleable and marketable within the imperial core and can make some publishing houses some money? Or are you advancing a practical project by which we are developing Marxism as a scientific tool for human liberation and a liberation of the planet, emancipation of the planet, and doing the practical work necessary by which to do that? In that regard, and this is my final word on the topic, and we can open up for questions, Western Marxism ultimately is an appeal by Losordo, is an appeal for a rejuvenation of anti-imperialist Marxism around the world, but also within the imperial core. So Alan, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Gabriel. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break for announcements. And following that, we're going to open up to questions and answers from participants. We have two sessions going on in parallel. We have a live Zoom session with call-in, people calling in who are participants. And then we have a chat, and then we also have the chat on the live stream. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do is to, those of you who are on the Zoom session, to go to the reactions button in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom window, raise your hand, we'll call on people. Please be patient today because we have quite a few people who are on this program right now, and keep your questions limited to just a couple of minutes, one question at a time. Those of you who are on the live stream, please post your questions in the chat on the YouTube live stream. With that, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, for those of you who have not participated in a Sunday morning at the Marxist Library session, we have been doing this for about 15 years now. Obviously, we did it before meeting live in Oakland, California at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. Since 2020, we've been doing these weekly streams at 10:30 every morning on Sunday mornings, every Sunday morning. You can sign up for our email notification list to get the link to the Sunday morning sessions at our website at icssmarx.org. That is icssmarx.org. Sharon, if you drop that in the chat, I appreciate it. There are also videos of our past sessions. We've had a variety of sessions, many speakers, great sessions on all kinds of topics related to Marxism, socialism, communism, and imperialism. We have a couple of we have some very interesting upcoming sessions. On September 15th, Radhika Desai, who's a professor at the Political Studies and the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, and the International Manifesto Group, will be speaking on the failure of neoliberal economics. That's September 15th. On September 22nd, we have a special program, U.S. Out of Korea. Paul Liam from the Korea Policy Institute and the U.S. Out of Korea uh, campaign will be speaking on recent developments on the Korean Peninsula. A lot of changes. I think a lot of people are not aware of some of the changes that have been going on, and a very aggressive and dangerous escalation of attacks on the Korean people that he's going to be speaking about. On September 29th, we're going to be hosting a discussion on the election. So you're welcome to join us for that. Pitch in your views. We're going to have a few speakers giving talks about different aspects of what's going on with the election. And then we have some great programs coming up in October. Go to our website at icssmarks.org, sign up if you wish, and you will receive email notifications. So again, I want to remind people that this is a comradely forum for political discussion. We ask that you respect the other participants and respect the moderator, and keep your questions brief, especially those of you who are regular participants, and put your questions in the chat on the live stream or raise your hand and we'll call on you. And what I'm going to do, Gabriel, a little bit different, since a lot of our participants, they may not know you very well, or the critical theory workshop. Could you just very briefly comment, not at a theoretical level, but maybe a more personal level, if you don't mind, how you as an academic and an intellectual in the US managed to not get sucked into the morass that you've been describing for the last hour? Like, what is it that inspired you, and why do you think you really have sort of taken this anti-imperialist revolutionary perspective? Thank you. And we'll go to questions after that.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alan, for the question. It's a little bit of, I guess you have a flattering image of me in the sense that I did get sucked into the morass. That was the problem. So I was trained within the tradition of kind of French theory, Frankfurt School, critical theory, and I was looking for the most radical theory on offer due to, working class background, growing up on a farm, knowing what exploitation is like, and wanting to have theory that would have an impact on the real world. And so I spent a lot of time thinking that, well, I needed to understand these really sophisticated things. And in retrospect, I guess I have the advantage of knowing that world from the inside. As far as my own orientation goes and why I didn't just remain a Western Marxist is, these are complex issues, but part of it has to do with organizing and being involved in material struggles and knowing what that's like. Part of it has to do with a changing geopolitical world and looking at the crisis of the biosphere, World War III, many other things. Yeah, and then exposure to, I think, some very good work that was clearly more rigorous and more convincing than anything else that I had read. And one of the things that's nice about the anti-materialist Marxist tradition, even just the theory that's produced within that tradition, is that it provides the best account of reality. And so in educating myself, because part of the problem was that I was educated in kind of prestigious universities, so I was miseducated and I wasn't given the tools necessary to really understand the world. So a lot of autodidacticism went into this as well, reading all of the things that were never on any syllabi, that I wasn't supposed to read, that nobody else was citing. So a complex, I guess, series of forces, I guess, have pushed me in that direction. I don't know if that answers it, but I'll leave it at that, and then we'll open up for some broader questions.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to start with Richard Fallenbaum, followed by Lucy. And again, those of you who are on the YouTube stream, go ahead and stick your questions in the chat on YouTube. So Richard, if you would unmute and ask your question, please.
Yeah,
So
I
Sheila
wonder
has
if you,
raised.
sorry?
No, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I wonder if you could focus on North America for a minute, particularly whether there is a Western Marxism, coherent Western Marxism in North America, and whether there's a coherent Eastern Marxism in North America.
We take one question at a time. So go ahead, Gabriel.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think if we understand these as a kind of academic imperialist Marxism on the one hand versus an anti-imperialist Marxism, then yeah, definitely within the US context. The US context in at least the academic world, because then we could also talk about the organizing world, which is unfortunately often quite distinct. The majority of self-declared Marxists in the academy are of the Western Marxist sort. Frederick Jameson, I think, would be probably one of the leading figures, but there are many others who would, I think, also fit within that overall category. They tend to be Trotskyists, social democrats, or even kind of anarcho-communists of sorts. And there are also some who are anti-imperialists, like myself, a lot of the people that I end up working with. And so I do see that division within the United States. But again, I think the core of what's driving a lot of intellectual production within the imperial core is the economic base. And there's a lot of forces that drive people to more imperialist positions because it means that you're not going to get canceled, you're not going to lose your job, you're going to have publishing opportunities and other such things. And a lot of the world of the Marxist intelligentsia is controlled in the United States and in Western Europe by the Western Marxists. Within the broader organizing world, I think there is, I mean, this has shifted to some extent, but there is also a strong tendency to have more kind of self-declared socialist parties that are opposed to most, if not all, forms of actually existing socialism. And then there's a fringe of political parties that do now, but might not have in the past, support actually existing socialist countries. So I think it's mixed, but again, the center of gravity for a lot of what goes on in the imperial core tends to be of the Western Marxist orientation.
Okay, next is Lucy. So Lucy, if you would unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Gabriel, for such a wonderful exposition of the West. I came out of the 1960s, 1970s movements that did coalesce more or less into groupings of Marxism and did study for a while, but most of it dissolved, and I think it may have been due to one was the Soviet Union, and then during the 1990s, that's when the group I was involved with faded away and said, go and join the, what was it? It had something to do with Gramsci. The thing is that we never really did study. We went out and did and worked and worked and worked constantly. We were sent to the factory. I ended up in McDonnell Douglas. And they threw me out, of course, because we didn't know what we were doing. And I think our group was did not have the background or the people who knew a little bit more of Marxism. In well, I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but we also lost people during that struggle. 5 of our members were gunned down by the Nazis in North Carolina in 1979. And so following that, our group disintegrated. But yeah, even though we didn't do a whole lot, I think we were part of something, and I felt good about it. It's just that it didn't go very far. And I've always wanted to know why, what happened. So
Okay, that's about 2 minutes. So Gabriel, do you want to respond?
I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
It's an important and very difficult question. Obviously, I'm not going to have a complete answer to it, but I do think that, one of the things that Fred Hampton always insisted on is that you need political education as the kind of beating soul of organizing, because political education is also the organizers educating themselves and having the tools necessary then to communicate a certain apprehension of reality, as well as how best to practically intervene in it. As far as the movements of the 60s and 70s, of course, I wasn't around then, but my historical interpretation of them is that there were at least two major setbacks. One was COINTELPRO and everything that the US national security state did to intervene, neutralize, and destroy any organized left within the United States. If people aren't familiar with that history, they need to know that history because it has an enormous impact on organizing today. There's 3 or 4 books that I recommend. If you just look up COINTELPRO papers, you'll find a few of them by Ward Churchill. There's one by Blackstock, I believe is the author's name. In any case, that was a brutal, brutal and dark history. Lots of people died, lots of people thrown in prison, etc. I believe it was 69 members of the American Indian movement were killed by, directly or indirectly by the U.S. national security state, and some 29 members of the Black Panther Party. But the other factor, and I think this is really important, Adolph Reed Jr. has done some significant work on this front, is that, of course, from our generation, or at least from my generation, I was born in the early 1970s. I look back on the 60s and think, well, that was the real radical high point in the United States. And to some extent, that's true, but I don't think that it captures the full breadth of organizing in the United States in the larger 20th century. Because now I see things as the real high point was the 1930s. That's when there was some real serious communist organizing. And that one of the things that you get in the 1960s and 70s is a kind of new left version that also is supported in various ways by the US national security state, because the new left presented itself sometimes as, there were at least 2 major problems with it. One is it often presented itself as anti-communist. And just opposed to actually existing socialism. And so it was a kind of anarchist new left. But then the second problem was that it was also often culturalist, meaning that it would privilege cultural categories and cultural modes of both analysis and organizing, as opposed to a class basis for organizing and analysis. And you can't, I think this has been proven by material history. The basis for our organizing needs to be class. But we shouldn't understand that as class reductionist or something like that, because if you really understand and study the history of gender relations, of sexual relations, of racial relations, these are class relations. The reason that we have ideologies that have racialized particular groups of people is because of the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism. These have been targeted as labor pools. And so the ideology of race is directly embedded within class relations. So we shouldn't separate them out or think somehow that they're distinct. But if we only operate and organize at this kind of superstructural or culturalist level, then we're not really addressing the root problems, which is a need for a class orientation, which you do have very strongly in the 1930s. And I think the final thing that I'll say is what we really need today is a rejuvenation of this anti-imperialist Marxism, both at the level of theory and, most importantly, at the level of practice. And we need to rebuild very quickly. And we also have to learn from mistakes. And I do think that the new left rejection of communism and the new left culturalism, these were mistakes. We can learn from them, move on, and build, hopefully, more powerful and forceful organizations in the future.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat from Ragin Bacon. I'm an undergrad student involved with pro-Palestinian activism on campus. I was just wondering if you had any general advice about organizing, things to be careful about, etc. And to tie it into your presentation, you might want to add how to escape the morass that you've been describing. So go ahead and comment on that. And then we'll come back, and I'm going to call on Sheila after that. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what's going on right now with global imperialism and the Israeli genocide is extreme, to say the least. And we're also in a moment where the entire kind of imperial superstructure, so the bourgeois state and the entire cultural apparatus, is locked in to try and destroy any progressive anti-imperialist organizing. And there's tons of people who have lost their jobs, been beat up, thrown in jail, had legal problems due to the fact that they're simply trying to do anti-imperialist organizing against a genocide. This means that what we need to do, and of course, then we'd have to enter into the details, find ways of continuing to organize and keep people as safe as possible, right? There's always a calculus that goes into organizing where if you go full throttle and you go all out, then most likely you're just going to end up in a place where you're not going to be able to organize anymore. And so you need a calculus of figuring out how you can be most effective over the medium and long term. And usually that means finding ways of pushing the envelope, but also protecting people, particularly those who are in most precarious situations, right? So people who are in the US, undocumented, for instance, or racialized groups, poor people, etc. And that then enters into a whole series of tactical debates that one would have to have. Tying this into one of the things that Alan highlighted, I think that, at least in my opinion, in the organizing I've been involved in on university campuses around the genocide, it's a U.S. genocide, right? And it's not just backed by, it's made possible by, armed by, funded by the leading imperialist power, is that we do have to be very clear, and this also has to do with political education. This isn't just a case of an Israeli rogue right-wing government engaging in a genocidal war. What it is at the highest level of understanding it is the cutting edge of global imperialism today. And we have to situate that genocide within the imperial project. And we have to situate the history of Israel within that project and know that history as a settler colony that comes directly out of the European colonial project and worked hand in glove with the leading colonial and imperial forces in order to set up what is ultimately an imperialist, anti-socialist wedge in West Asia or the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, against pan-Arab socialism, against the self-determination of the Arab states, and ultimately also targeting both the incredibly rich natural resources in the region, as well as the geostrategic importance of that area as a kind of hub where Europe, Asia, and Africa more or less all come together. And all of that has to be part of, I think, the overall analysis so that we're not simply, I mean, we need to be organizing to stop a genocide, but we need to understand that stopping that genocide is one part of a much broader strategy, and that is stopping imperialism. And we need to be able to recognize that imperialism is manifesting itself in this specific way right now in against the Palestinian people, but that it has parallels in what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. And this is just part of the ongoing imperial drive that is the kind of core, really, of the US state.
Okay, next is Sheila. If you would unmute and ask your question again, please try to keep it within a couple of minutes. Then we'll go back to chat. Go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, a quick note. If anybody here is a member of Pacifica and a KPFA perhaps, and you'll want to avoid the Western Marxists, please vote for the candidates running with Rescue Pacifica. Okay. My other point was, I'm wondering if you have heard or familiar with the case of the Uhuru Three. You see my t-shirt here, Hands Off Uhuru, who are on trial now in Tampa, Florida, being charged with unregistered foreign agents of Russia, basically because of their political campaigns, which they've been running for decades, and also because they ran a political candidate in some local election who got 18% of the vote, and the Democratic Party got pissed off, and they're saying this is Russian interference with U.S. elections. So I'm wondering if you can comment on their case. And are you a member of a party? Thanks.
Alan, should I go ahead?
Yeah, we're going to take them one at a time.
Yeah.
So keep it focused.
Yeah, I am familiar with the case, right? Because it's the African People's Socialist Party that they've been going after. And I think, I haven't followed the case in great detail, but my understanding of it is that it's a classic case of the state going after a pan-Africanist organization that has been around for years, that is doing, local community organizing of the sort that they want to try to crush, but that they're also trying to use it as an example to have a kind of chilling effect on organizing across the board by affiliating left-wing organizing somehow with being, the so-called puppets of Putin and all of the other ridiculous stuff that they say. And so it's part of a larger PR assault on the organized left. As far as political parties, I was involved in a political party for a number of years. I stepped down about 9-10 months ago, I guess now, due to some problems that I had with the orientation of the party and the fact that the party leadership was not open to changing and reorienting itself and showed some very clear signs of being, unfortunately, more on the side of a bureaucratic centralist than a democratic centralist form of party organizing. And so that's where I currently stand, open to, very supportive of many parties. I'm a fellow traveler of some other parties and am always open ears if somebody wants to reach out to me and share with me the best party that they think is currently operative. I do find, and I might say this as a last thing, organizing in the leading imperialist country, I find extremely difficult, and there are many perversions in the history of political parties in the United States. And in my experience in organizing, the worst perversion that has infected many parties is opportunism. And that has led to many problematic positions, as well as many party structures that, unfortunately, I don't think are really serving the cause of revolutionary transformation. They're serving the cause of propping up a leadership that feeds off of the dues of those who are providing them on the base, so the kind of grassroots. And so what we really do need is a very robust party that is doing the right kind of work. So again, reach out if you have suggestions or want to do a follow-up and discussion of some of the details regarding particular parties.
Okay, next, we're going to take a question from the chat. NH Kazi asks, in other words, how can we clarify which contradictions we accept and which are co-optations and counter-revolutionary forces? In other words, I think that what NH Kazi is asking is, a lot of politics are flying around right now. How can people avoid, what are some steps they could take, some of these young activists, getting sucked into the morass of Western Marxism? So go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question because I think ultimately it will be the primacy of practice that determines those things. So a key example, and I saw there was another question in the YouTube chat, so maybe this will deal with that to some extent. A lot of the Western Marxists, when the Chinese government engaged in the project of reform and opening up, they cried foul and said, lo and behold, China's going capitalist. In fact, maybe even it's going imperialist. And that's henceforth been the kind of standard position among the Western Marxists, is that China is not socialist, it's capitalist and maybe even imperialist. I think in that particular case, that's a contradiction that we can point to, because the reform and opening up did allow for capitalist investment, within the Chinese state, while the state was still controlled by the Communist Party, and the towering heights of the economy, including in particular the banking sector, are still state controlled. And so it's a very hybrid form, if you will. And I think it's a good example insofar as now, at least in hindsight, one might have said, oh, in the 90s, where exactly is this going to head? But I think it's very clear. In fact, Losordo was always a very strong supporter. He came out on the side of China in the Sino-Soviet split, and then was a very strong supporter of Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up, because he said that what Deng really taught us as Marxists is that socialism is and should not be a socialism of misery. It should be one of common prosperity. And you need to develop the productive forces to do that. And so allowing for some capitalist investment in order to do that, while nonetheless controlling the state and the towering heights of the economy, is the practical solution that the Chinese came up with. So that for me would be an example of a contradiction that over time now, and looking back on China, I think it's clear. It's on a socialist path of a unique sort, but it's nonetheless, it's one of the leaders in the developing an environmental civilization. It has the poverty alleviation program that has alleviated 850 million people. It's the largest in the history of humanity. It surpasses the entire population of Latin America. Name one single capitalist country that would ever even think of doing that, let alone actually implement and do it. It's clear that some of its policies are socialistically oriented. That said, I think that this really gets complicated in much more difficult situations where there are forms of kind of opportunist leadership and forms of revisionism. You see this in the history of the Soviet Union. You see this in some of the Eastern Bloc countries, the former socialist countries in the Eastern Bloc, where revisionism really did take over. Ludo Martin's book on the history of the Soviet Union, all of his work on the history of the Soviet Union, I think is quite good on this. And there you do see some contradictions that are operative with, for instance, Khrushchev throwing Stalin completely under the bus for a number of reasons, and in my opinion, largely overstating some of his claims in that regard, was an attempt to then also shore up and improve relations with the West. These were tactical decisions that were made, but I think in hindsight, we can point to some of the revisionist decisions as being decisions that were really straying from a stronger Marxist-Leninist orientation, and hence we can be critical of them. But again, ultimately, I think that it's the primacy of practice, and history is going to tell. And so we need a little bit of historical perspective in order to be able to do that. In the heat of the moment, it's very difficult. You know, you're going to have to make decisions and say, well, from my vantage point at this point in time, this seems like the most appropriate position, while still remaining open to revision if new information comes in and you find out, oh, you know, actually, I was wrong about these particular things. Maybe the last thing that I would say on that is one of the most important things to do is get access to reliable information, because the imperial superstructure constantly pumps out propaganda regarding actually existing socialist states, right? There's not a genocide against the Uyghurs in China. This is a fabricated, it's catastrophe fabrication, it's atrocity fabrication. It's been very well detailed in a number of scholarly works, journalistic works, etc. The genocide is happening where they say it's not, in places like Gaza, for instance. And so we have to get reliable information so that we can judge in the best way possible. Sorry if that is, you know, punting a little bit to the primacy of practice, but I ultimately think that's where we have to come down on sorting out what contradictions are contradictions that we'd see as acceptable tactical contradictions in relationship to the long term versus ones that ultimately don't work out because they simply go more in a kind of revisionist path of compromise with Western powers. And we saw where that led, you know, I'm sorry, the very last thing that I'll say is one of the things that's powerful about Ludo Martin's analysis of actually existing socialist states in the East is that what he says was ultimately defeated wasn't Marxism-Leninism, it was revisionism. And this is a very, very important point. The government that was overthrown in the Soviet Union wasn't a Marxist-Leninist government. It was a revisionist government through and through. And it was a revolution from above. And so in hindsight, again, I think we can say, and they basically, you know, created parallel organizations to the Communist Party. It was a kind of internal coup d'etat from above on the part of the revisionist and the Western-oriented members of the leadership. And so in that regard, that type of contradiction is one that I would not support, if you will. So I'll leave it at that. Again, these are enormous, very good questions, so we could have hours of debate around them.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Citizen One. So Raj, if you would unmute yourself.
Yeah, Gabriel, thank you for your talk. I substantially agree with you, most of the things. I would like to discuss with you a little bit on how do you define imperialism? Because the reason I ask is because for Lenin, I'm sure you're very familiar with his work on imperialism. He says this is a stage in capitalism that arrived around 1900. And that it is the last movement of last quarter when a lot of properties of a lot of characteristics of capitalism itself become their opposite. Now, I give you an example. Britain colonized India in the pre-imperialist stage. So in a sense, it colonized India, so it was an imperialist power. On the other hand, its capitalism used the resources of India, manpower and material, and gained a lot, ruled the world. So it was an imperial power, but its stage of capitalism was not imperialist stage. Lenin said it arrives around 1900, the whole world gets divided. So given this two definitions of imperialism, which one is yours? And secondly, where do we stand if we look at Lenin's imperialism in the world today?
Go ahead,
Great
Gabriel.
question. So I really was just using imperialism in a very general sense to include the history of colonialism, right? So just thinking imperialism as the capitalist endeavor to use the natural resources, labor, and markets of the colonial and semi-colonial countries in order to develop themselves. But as you point out, right, Lenin had a specific understanding of imperialism as a very particular phase, the highest phase of capitalist development. And he highlights, of course, 5 different features of imperialism as he understood it. One of them being that the world of colonies was completely divided up, right? There were no longer any quote unquote, territories that were ripe for colonization. So there are elements already within Lenin in which, of course, he would recognize the history of colonialism, but he was analyzing a really specific conjuncture where the leading imperial powers now enter into competition with one another over the colonies, or at least that's one aspect of his understanding of imperialism. And in that regard, I think that the imperialist phase of capitalism, which, it has a whole series of different aspects. The prominence of finance capital is particularly important. And the role of this kind of inter-imperialist rivalry, I think that if we look at Lenin's analysis and then look at the early 21st century that we're in, 100 years later, basically, we are in a situation that would best be described as late imperialism, where the basic components that Lenin analyzed are still very much operative in the world today, meaning that the leading imperialist powers are still in somewhat of a competition over the colonies, although the configuration has changed, right? The world wars between World War I and World War II was a kind of long inter-imperialist rivalry. And what came out of that is that instead of Germany being the leading imperialist force, it was the United States. And then the Western imperialist powers became junior partners in that project. And so there was a partial resolution, if you will, to the inter-imperialist rivalry, at least insofar, and there's still rivalries, but at least insofar as there's a leading imperialist power. But the other thing that's very important, of course, is that then you have an expansion of the socialist world between the end of World War II and at least the end of the 1970s. And in that regard, imperialism is actually a little bit on its heels during that time due to the anti-colonial revolutions that were sweeping the world. From China going socialist in 49 to Korea to Vietnam to 1959 and socialism, revolutionary socialism coming to the Western Hemisphere with Cuba and on and on and on. And so those anti-colonial movements actually beat the imperialist forces back. And a lot of what people understand as neoliberalism is really an attempt to rejuvenate the imperial project and go on the assault. And so what we see from about the 70s up to today is an attempt to rev up a new version of capitalism via the neoliberal kind of configuration of it, which has a whole series of different components to it that we could go into, and to beat back the socialist project. And that was somewhat successful insofar as it led to the destruction of the Soviet Union and Eastern style or Soviet style socialism, but it didn't succeed in decimating the socialist project across the board, which we clearly see with China and the rise of China today. And so I think that what we see is, a reconfiguration of the geopolitical landscape with an imperialism that was on its heels under American leadership in the early post-World War II era, then aggressively went on the offensive from kind of the 70s. I mean, it was always on the offensive, but actually began succeeding more from about the 70s forward. And our particular moment is very interesting and very rich insofar as the US imperialist project is not as powerful as it once was. And so both the rise of China, the prominence of Russia, Iran, other countries that are opposed to US imperialism and have been working together more and more in developing, what most people refer to as a multipolar world. This is at least a preliminary step in pushing back against the powers of late imperialism, with China being a leading force in that as a self-declared socialist country. And so hopefully, and I think this is some of the most important work to be done, we're putting ourselves in a situation where imperialism has much more trouble advancing to the extent that it would like to, and we can see a new phase of global class struggle in which late imperialism is ultimately given the death knell that it deserves and that Lenin wanted to give it back, 100 years ago. And that will all depend, of course, on global class struggle and a whole series of other features. I would recommend in this regard, if people are familiar with John Bellamy Foster, has some excellent writings on late imperialism. Cheng En-fu and Lu Baolin also have writings on what they refer to, I believe, as hyper-imperialism. Their terminology is slightly different, but it's very similar. They've published some of their articles in English on Monthly Review's website. There's a few others who are kind of in this current debate, which I think is really rich on late and hyper-imperialism. So I'll leave it at that for this quick one.
Yeah, so you consider BRICS as an anti-imperialist association then?
I think that BRICS has elements that can be understood as anti-imperialist in a specific sense, and that is that they are developing an international network of global relations, financial relations, political relations that are not purely beholden to the Washington Consensus with IMF, World Bank, and everything else. Does that then mean that they are going to lead the kind of anti-imperialist revolution and make us all socialist or something along those lines? No, I think we have to be very sober and dialectical in our analysis of BRICS, right? It is not an organization that just brings together socialist countries. Many of these countries are capitalists themselves. Many of them work in various ways with the capitalist countries, and they're hedging their bets in relationship to China and other alternatives. But in general, I do think that if we're serious about gaining traction against imperialism, and we recognize imperialism as the fundamental contradiction operative within global politics today and the economy, then we need to beat back imperialism in order to create space for socialist projects. Like what's happening across the Sahel region in Africa, I think is very interesting in this regard. And so I see BRICS at least as partially contributing to that, but we shouldn't overemphasize or kind of overstate its particular role in that regard.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat, and then we'll have Citizen One followed by Janet. First of all, Millie, I lost your question. If you could repost your question on the chat at the bottom, I'd like to get that in. From Fikri, the Berlin Wall fell on left movements all over the world. Is it possible to overcome this defeat without learning from the Soviet experience? What new socialist movements cannot repeat the past? So maybe you could kind of give your interpretation of the question and then respond to it, and then we'll have Citizen One come back live. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, it was an enormous setback for the global socialist movement, and one of the things that we need to do is learn from the practical successes and failures of the entire Soviet and Soviet-style experiment. And there's a lot that could be said about this, of course. Maybe just one of the things that is in the forefront of my mind, given the conversation that we just had, is that China's orientation is to a very large extent, and Losordo has written very poignantly on this in his book Class Struggle and his book The Communist Question, which we're currently having translated into English and will hopefully come out relatively soon, is that China studied the Soviet experiment and learned a lot from where they thought, the Chinese thought, that it made mistakes and tried to adjust accordingly. And part of one of the mistakes that the Soviets, I think, made, I already mentioned revisionism was probably the core mistake in that regard, but they entered into a very confrontational arms race with the West that was extremely debilitating at an economic level. And they had a lot of difficulty, there's the famous book, Revolution from Above, Care, and I can't remember the other author's name right now, which is excellent on this front. They point out that some of the economic problems that the Soviets ran into were largely due to the enormous successes of its industrialization. So the Soviet industrial development between basically 1917 and about the 1960s, 1970s was absolutely extraordinary, with the enormous setback, of course, of World War II and the Nazi attempt to destroy the Soviet Union. It was truly extraordinary. In fact, according to some statistics, surpassed any industrial development in the history of the world. But they had a lot of trouble transitioning to new forms of labor organizing and new forms of the productive organization in general through the cybernetics revolution and the digital revolution. And they quickly fell behind the West. And a lot of that was due to a lack of technology transfer and over insistence on really focusing on industry more so than on some of these technological developments, as well as the orientation towards needing to keep up with the arms race. Now, when you look at China, these are lessons that they've learned, right? There have been elements of revisionism. There's obviously fights within the Central Committee. The current leadership, though, is pretty clear about at least what they say they're doing, and that is that they're Marxist-Leninists and that they will not divert from that Marxist-Leninist path, but that they're very keen on technology transfer from the West. This is also, of course, one of the things that Deng Xiaoping, with the reform opening up, one of the goals was, Deng went to Japan and he went to other places. He looked at the factories and it's like, it doesn't matter how hard the Chinese work. These Japanese or the other factories, he went to France as well and was aware of what was going on in the West. You don't need to be so productive at the level of labor if you have robotics or if you have new forms of technological development. So one of the goals of China was to get the technology transfer and make that transition that the Soviets weren't able to make. If we look at them today with everything that they've been doing, I think it's beyond a doubt that they've been very successful in technological development because they've been leading the world in many ways. And in doing, you look at electronic vehicles, for instance, which now the U.S. has basically imposed tariffs to support Elon Musk, who's a national security state cutout anyway, and keep the U.S.-based EV, market protected because the Chinese are outperforming. They're making these vehicles that they could sell in the United States for $10,000 that tend to function much better, be more affordable, and be more accessible. And so in that regard, you see, I think, China learning from the failures of the Soviets, trying to maintain an anti-revisionism, trying to get technology transfer, and then also relating to the West in terms of a constant motif of promotion of peace. We don't want war. The Chinese they have one military base outside of their territory in the Horn of Africa to fight piracy. The United States has upwards of 800, of course. They haven't been involved in an armed conflict outside of their own territory for decades and decades, and they're constantly begging for peace. That's what they want. They want peaceful development. And so I think these are all lessons that the Chinese have learned from others. We could also then look and should look at Cuba or other places. We could look at Venezuela, we could look at Nicaragua, et cetera, and see what they've learned and what they're trying to do in various ways. Nicaragua is a very interesting example because they also, I think, not unlike the Chinese, are trying to introduce models where, okay, we have some capitalist investment, but we keep control of the state. We work more with China. And so looking at and mapping out all of these different experiments, I think, is important for us to learn from practical experiments, but then also figure out what the next steps are.
Okay, next is going to be Citizen One, and I'm going to ask the folks that have their hands up on the live Zoom session to please keep your questions short because we're running out of time. So Citizen One, followed by Janet, followed by back to the chat and then to Janet. So go ahead, Citizen One.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your lecture. I found it very informative. I just wanted to say, gee, on the YouTube live stream, you were actually interrupted by an Obama YouTube commercial calling for ordinary people to send money to the Kamala campaign. I say let the corporations support these duopolistic candidates and leave ordinary people alone from having to send part of their grocery and gas money to these corporate candidates. to the undergraduate, I want to say, you know, the reason there's been increased oppression in the past year or two of the pro-Palestinian human rights and liberation movement is because our message is winning, and this is how desperate they are getting. I just want to say, you know, I alluded in some chat posts that people can read about my being kicked out of a generally Marxist discussion group because I asserted that white workers do have racial privilege over non-white workers. And I was the only Black person in that group. Apparently, such Marxists believe that Black and white workers have always been equally oppressed. I don't think this is something most Black people are going to buy. And I was accused of being a race essentialist. So this goes to the argument about, you know, it's class, but not race, you know, this either or argument. When I would argue, why can't it be both? You alluded to Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers. I mean, I was accused of engaging in identity politics. The Panthers had Black in their name. Okay. So I don't think they're going to buy, you know, that they were going to buy that it's only class and not race. As I said, either or, but why can't it be both and? And you alluded to Adolph Reed. Adolph Reed, Sr. and Jr., incredibly, to any Black person, argued that race is not a useful measure of anything in American society. So, yeah, I'm wondering what you have to say about this ongoing argument. It's tied in with, you know, many Marxist and other leftist accusations of engaging in identity politics. When, you know, the average Black person certainly believes that it's both race and class, especially on their in race. And just a couple of examples of that.
Oh, just, you know, actually it's 2.5 minutes now. Why don't we
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. Go ahead, Gabriel, if you want to comment.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to keep because I see a lot of hands, I'm going to try to keep my responses short. But I agree with a lot of what you said. I think you make some excellent points. I do think that the clearest analysis of the relationship between race and class needs to be a historical analysis in which you look at because the point that Adolph Reed Jr. makes, like Barbara and Karen Fields and some others, is that there aren't different races. There's no scientific basis for that claim. There's one race that is the human race, and then there are socioeconomic systems that have tried to distinguish between different races and organize them in hierarchies. And the reason that capitalism has done that is because that creates a hierarchy that is largely a labor hierarchy in which Blacks were then subjected to slavery or to lower wages or to various forms of social oppression. And that, I think, needs to be part of the understanding of how class and race operate. Race, Adolph Reed Jr. says, is an ideology, but that doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist, right? Racism exists because it's part of a material ideology that's been produced by capitalism. And so ultimately, if you want to be serious about fighting racism, you have to reconfigure the material relations of production so that you don't have these racialized underclasses who are doing the quote unquote shit jobs, who are also oppressed and who are underpaid often for their labor in various ways. But that also means, and I think Reed is good on this, that there is a professional managerial class that is made up of racialized groups. And so identity politics is a tricky thing because identity politics has been a way that the capitalist ruling class has weaponized many of the very just struggles for racial liberation coming out of the 60s and 70s and tried to funnel them into a kind of corporate representative tokenist model in which they make purely symbolic changes in order to keep the material system operating as it needs to, right? So you have Obama as a Black president who was actually bad for the majority of Black workers. And that's a perfect form of identity politics, and we should be able to diagnose that. But at the same time, and I should say identity politics is an imperial product. The goal of the US empire is to make the professional managerial class of the empire look more and more like the victims of empire so that people don't recognize that it's an empire. That's the goal. So that they want different people doing the exact same job. That's Kamala Harris's job, right? That's what she's being sold as right now. She's not going to change anything regarding the real class and racial dynamic. She's going to be this type of token. While recognizing that, we cannot fall into the kind of right-wing trend of then saying, well, all these things about race and gender and sexuality, all this woke identity politics is just crap and we should just throw it all out. No, we have to take, and Losordo is excellent on this, we have to say the problem with the liberal ideology of the capitalist state is that it just makes tokens out of these people and gives symbolic change instead of substantive change. We as Marxists advocate for substantive change, and we need to uplift materially and symbolically the most oppressed members of the global working class, who historically have always been women and racialized groups. And that is the project of universalizing human dignity. And that's what Marxists do. It's not what liberals do. It's not what the representational politics do. And it's not what identity politics does. So we got to be critical of woke and identity politics while uplifting the most oppressed of the working class in order to make material changes and universalize human dignity. Right? So it's not about giving up on the struggle against racism or the struggle against misogyny. On the contrary, it's about fully understanding them and how they're rooted in a class dynamic of labor, of using women as domestic slaves, of subjecting them to a whole series of forms of social reproductive labor that's uncompensated. That needs to be changed. We don't just need some corporate, really anti-feminist woman in the White House, for instance. So sorry, I'll leave it at that.
From the chat, Millie asked the question, how do you feel about Turkey? You've already addressed the BRICS NATO question, but I think that to try to draw that question out a little bit, I think what Millie is asking is, how do you feel about countries like Turkey that, unlike, say, Venezuela and maybe even Iran, are not part of the axis of resistance, but do have an aspect of potential contradictions as well as alignment with imperialism? Turkey, perhaps even Saudi Arabia. So you want to comment on that for Billy?
India
Then we'll
would
come
be
back to
another.
Janet. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. I mean, I think that BRICS is a complex configuration, right? And other global organizations of this sort. And I think that what is important is to look at it tactically from the point of view of the socialist state building projects and where they're oriented. And the goal should be not just to have, I mean, if you want to just have an absolute war between the capitalist countries and the few socialist countries, it's pretty clear how that's going to play out. What we really need is socialist countries that are tactically intelligent enough that they can work with countries that have projects of national development that often do align with the imperialists, but find ways of tactically getting them to move away from them. Look at the history of what's happened to Russia over the last decade. That is very significant, where prior to Syria, for instance, Russia was much more aligned on the Western powers. They've been drifting toward the East. And this doesn't mean, like, I have my criticisms of Russia, I'm sure lots of other people do too, but the goal should be to develop power on the socialist left. And in order to do that, sometimes you need to make tactical alliances with countries that ultimately are either capitalist or traffic in various forms of supporting imperialist endeavors. But ideally do it in such a way that you can leverage them and begin to move them in your direction. If the contrary happens, and then you have the socialist countries all moving further towards the right or getting involved in various imperialist endeavors, then we have a real serious problem on our hands. I don't see that happening at this point in time. I see us much more in a kind of tug of war. And there are these states. Turkey's a very good example of it. India, for very different reasons, is another example. They're kind of situated, they're hedging their bets. They're working with some people and then working with others. They're trying to position themselves in a geostrategic world in which they're not aligned on one camp or the other. And so those are the countries that ultimately need to be won over to the better camp. And so I understand why countries like China have had a policy of working with them and trying to integrate them as opposed to exclude them. While I also recognize that there are some valid critiques of how China has allied with particular countries. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Keith. And Janet, go ahead. Please try to keep questions down because we're running really late. So go ahead, Janet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation. So following up on the African People's Socialist Party, it's an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialism party, which focuses on reparations for African American working people and Africa itself, because the resources of Africa have been plundered over the centuries. Where does the APSP fit into your Western Marxism paradigm?
Yeah, in short, I would say from what I know about them, because I'm not an expert on them, they are oriented away from the Western left denigration of actually existing socialism. Now, pan-Africanism is a very complex kind of project and has a complex history to it. I would say at a minimum, there are kind of at least two different orientations within the history of pan-Africanism. Some of them do go more in the direction of a kind of race-first mode of analysis. Some of them go more in the direction of a pan-Africanism that's understood as, well, we're bringing the African continent together, but we're also doing that in conjunction with bringing all oppressed workers together around the world, regardless of whether or not they're from Africa or elsewhere. Thomas Sankara would be a good example of someone who sometimes is classified as a Pan-Africanist, tended to kind of avoid the term himself, or Walter Rodney would be another example, who really focus on African politics, but then understand that the oppression of Africans is one part of a larger puzzle, which is the oppression of the third world in general. And I think that is the most trenchant and clearest position to take. And so if Pan-Africanism means, yeah, let's get all Africans together to work with all Asians and to work with all Latin Americans and all oppressed workers around the world, then yes, absolutely. If it's more of a race-first analysis and a kind of African exceptionalist discourse, then I think Walter Rodney's critiques, for instance, of people like Stokely Carmichael, of people like Nkrumah and others, I think they hold up to scrutiny. And I'd recommend, if people aren't familiar with the book, unfortunately mistitled Decolonial Marxism, goes into some of this.
The APSP does not focus on race. It doesn't, it's
Okay.
about class, and I encourage you to look more into it.
Okay. Then the reference to Africa is as a class category in relationship to the history of global imperialism?
It's about stealing the resources of the people in that country, in Africa.
The continent. Yeah. Then it sounds like it would be closer to, which I think is, for me, the most cogent position, that taken by the likes of Walter Rodney, Thomas Sankara, and others like that, meaning that I'd be fully supportive.
Okay, Keith lowered your hand. You're welcome to raise it again. I'll call on you, but I'm going to go to Sharon. So Sharon, if you would please ask your question, and again, try to keep it short.
Yes, well, it's more of a comment. Thank you very much, Gabriel. I hope we can have you back for a deeper discussion. You mentioned some flashpoints in the capitalist class going after the Marxist left and in general, the Marxists in general, people who call themselves Marxists, whatever stripe. And you mentioned COINTELPRO, which of course is a major flashpoint. I would just want to mention that even earlier, right after the Second World War, the head of the Communist Party, Earl Browder, led the party in essentially dissolution of the party, that they became the Communist Political Association, I think it was. And that created, I think, an alienation by people who really wanted to be Marxists and Marxist-Leninists, and that was the beginning of the new left, in my opinion, although the new left, calling itself the new left, didn't start for another decade and a half or something like that. But I think it was a very unfortunate, thing that happened, which we have to understand historically in the broad sweep of the communist movement in this country. And I think you also, no, I'll stop there. Thank you.
You want to make a comment? Go ahead, Gabriel.
Well, just very quickly, I couldn't agree more. People should be familiar with the Palmer raids in the interwar years. They should be familiar with the Smith Act, the McCarran Act. The assault on the communist left has been a constant throughout the history of the country. And those are, as you mentioned, a very important flashpoint as well.
Okay, next is Norma. If you would ask your question,
Thank you.
please go ahead.
Hi, this has been lovely. Thank you, Gabriel. The post I put up is about our speaker last week. If you know of him, Joe Romero Hermeto. And I bring him forward because what he talked about was us all being enveloped by the doctrines of the capitalists. We're so controlled by that. It's just worth reminding ourselves that that's what he was talking about, and many of us will recall that. I'm not recommending you read any more than you've already read about everything.
Yeah, I'm familiar with his work on intellectual property. Yeah, it's a Marxist critique of intellectual property, and I was pleased to see that you had him on. Absolutely.
Great. Next is Rich J. If you would please go ahead, Rich J. Please unmute. There you go. We hear you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, well, yeah, great program so far. I love it. And you stole my question. Well, I'm going to try to get a little more out of you, but because you said the word Ukraine, you might have said a couple things I missed, but you've talked around it. Okay. So, but what I find is interesting to me is that, is that we're getting, thank you to many of the Palestinian students and all the people doing the work on the campuses and in their communities. Okay, it's
Rich, you're kind of breaking up.
Or,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't. It might. I hope it's not my phone. Anyway, my question is a little bit where I see a break. People cannot really argue against against the fight against God. I can't even say the word right now.
Genocide.
What's going on? Thank you. I know the word. Genocide in Gaza. You can't argue against it. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. You don't have to agree, disagree, whatever. It's just immoral, regardless of your politics. So, and that's good for us. I mean, it's one point on our side that makes it, we can't avoid it. It cannot be avoided. Although I think a lot of people still do. But the thing is, what I find a break is where people aren't clear, or to me, they're not clear about what's going on in the Ukraine with NATO in particular, with Russia and the U.S. military against Russia through just using the Ukrainians. So I would like a little more, if you could say a little bit more about that. Personally, I'm scared shitless that we're going to get into a hot war with Russia that will lead into the war with China that they're all talking about, the U.S. military. So go take that, see what you can say with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing it up, because I do think that I couldn't agree more. Like, when across the Marxist left in the United States, if you're more of a Western Marxist or an anti-imperialist Marxist, most people recognize there's a genocide going on. We should not support this. But when it comes to Ukraine, actually, those positions become very different for the most part. What I've tended to see is that a lot of the, not a lot, but some at least of the Western Marxists, Slavoj Žižek's a good example of that. They are complete supporters of what is ultimately a U.S. proxy war in the Ukraine, using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder against Russia, with ultimately China in the background. And that the history of this conflict needs to be understood, not in terms of, well, in real terms, which is that it is the history of NATO imperialist expansion to the east, which was promised not to happen. Of course, the US and the NATO forces have gone back on that repeatedly. If you know the history of NATO, actually, NATO was stocked with Nazis in the post-World War II era, and it was actually one of the pet projects of Himmler was to have a joint military command between Western Europe and the United States that could be then used to target the East and the Soviet Union in particular. And that's where NATO comes from. So it's an imperial project through and through. It is stocked itself. It has fascists. It has had them historically, like straight up Nazis in leadership. And there's a very important Nazi contingent within Ukraine, which is now the state itself being run basically as a totalitarian state. The media has been taken over. The Communist Party has been shut down. The communists and socialists have been thrown in jail. Elections have been postponed, et cetera, et cetera. And so what you have is basically a totalitarian state being used by the US via NATO as a weapon of war against Russia. And I think you're absolutely right. They're heating this up, heating this up, heating this up. And World War III is constantly just on the horizon. And that is very, very dangerous. And the people driving this are not the Russians. They're not the Chinese. The people driving this are the imperialists. They're the US and NATO. And so within the Marxist camp, I think we have to be crystal clear about that. The imperialist force operative in the Ukraine is NATO and the US. That's what's going on. You can have criticisms of Russia. Russia is not a socialist state. There are very strong conservative elements within Russia. It has a bourgeois national development project. At the same time, Russia intervened in order to stop a war that began in 2014 after a fascist government was put in power by the United States that had killed some 14,000 Russians in the eastern regions of the Ukraine. And they intervened in order to support that independence movement and to denazify it. There are other motives, right? There are some financial motives and things like that. It's not some clear-cut case, but I think what is crystal clear is the imperialists are the Westerners, not those who are trying to fight against imperialism in the East.
Okay, Richard, thank you for your patience. Richard Wright, please unmute yourself. And then we're going to wrap it up. We'll have Citizen One, and then we're going to wrap this up soon. So Richard Wright, please go ahead.
Patient, yes, patient. Actually, I had a couple of questions. I'll let you pick which one. One was I'm an advocate of the interpenetrating modes of production. I was wondering if maybe you could comment on that. Or the other question is, as you might be able to guess, I've been around a few years longer than you have, and I'm a product of a lot of the peace and solidarity, the church movements, if you will. And it seems to me that they are sort of a contradiction there between them and the Marxists. I'll leave it there for you to comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I would just say very quickly, I mean, I do think that historically there has been an interpenetration of modes of production. It's not like capitalism developed and then, that was it. And this does lead, though, then to more kind of complex debates within political economy between, mainly the kind of Luxembourg approach, which is that capitalism feeds off of and needs to feed off of other modes of production in order to run itself, versus those who are, for the most part, closer to Lenin and Luxembourg, who don't see it quite as a necessary dependence. I haven't engaged enough in contemporary global political economy to be very clear on exactly where I stand on those issues. I just know it's an important debate, and I think it's significant. The second question that you had was on. Can you just remind me? Sorry, I didn't jot it down. I was thinking more about the modes of production. The church.
The peace and solidarity movement, if you will, which comes a lot out of the church movement, which is basically a witness, one of witness. And anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some Marxists who approach religion and just say, hey, it's the opiate of the masses, like, let's just get rid of religion entirely and just be pure atheists and things like this. And, that might be for some future point in time, but I think a much more coherent position is that, well, in our day and age, there are an enormous number of people who are believers, and churches are incredible organizing tools and organizing institutions. So why would we give up on them? And another quote from Marx is he not only said that it was the opiate of the masses, but he also said that religion is the cry of the oppressed, right? It's the way that the oppressed workers express themselves. And so we can also give them new and different tools to express themselves, to understand, right, that it might not be God's will that would keep them in subordinate positions, but that there would be a capitalist ruling class and a whole system that would keep them there. And so my position on that is that I think that we should find ways, and there are very important ways, the history of liberation theology is a good example of it, of drawing on the power of organized religion in order to bring people into a common struggle that doesn't necessarily have to be based on a metaphysical belief in an other world. It can be based on real human values of uplifting the most oppressed and supporting those members of our community who are in need, and drawing on those religious elements that really bring out the best in humanity and connecting them to elements of Marxist organizing that are pushing in the exact same direction, which is we're not only, trying to change the economic mode of production, we're also trying to overcome oppression and uplift people and give them dignity and give them meaning and create societies in which we can all live as much as possible a fuller life.
Okay, last question. Let's try to keep it short because we're already 15 minutes over. So Citizen One, please go ahead.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I forgot to say that historically, white workers, especially in the U.S. South, were allowed and even encouraged to be terrorists against Black workers. And I want to say, race, of course, has no biological reality, but race certainly had a legal reality in this country. And I want to add that when Adolph Reed, Sr. and Jr., said that race is no longer a useful measure of anything in American society, they both said that before the rise and presidency of Trump. And the last thing I want to say is, I accuse people who want to say it's only race and, it's only class and not race to be class essentialists. So with my minor correction, for lack of a better word, for your excellent answer, Gabriel, I just wanted to say that race certainly had a legal reality in this country.
Yeah. No, that's a really important point. I mean, the Nazis studied racial law in the United States because they recognized it as being at the vanguard of racial statecraft. And what's his name? Whitman is his last name, has quite a good book on the legal history of what the Nazis integrated. And in certain cases, they found actually that race law in the United States went further than the Nazis were willing to palate, which is worth thinking about for a while. The maybe last thing that I'll say on that, though, is that this is also, if we hearken back to what I was saying at the beginning about understanding the superstructure as being both the political legal apparatus and the broader cultural apparatus that formats social consciousness, you see that race is an ideology, right? It's an ideology that's inscribed within the political and legal apparatus of the history of the US state. And it also operates within the larger kind of cultural world by producing an ideology that there are people who, due to the color of their skin, are somehow morally, politically, socially inferior, and therefore should be treated as such and can be less, abused, and other such things. And so my position, drawing on Adolph Reed's work, it sounds like we have certain disagreements. I think that sometimes too, Reed, he makes polemical statements. The way I read him in terms of his kind of broader corpus is that what he's saying is that race is an ideology that has very powerful impacts in the world. It's not an actual reality. There isn't a thing called race. And therefore, what we need to do is understand where that ideology comes from. And it comes from a set of labor relations that are integral to the history of capitalism. And therefore, we need to both attack the question of race and the question of class as dialectically intertwined within the capitalist system, rather than disarticulating them and thinking that we can only do class or only do race. And it sounds like at that level, we line up. and share a similar orientation. So thank you for your question and comments. And thank everybody else. These questions and comments have been phenomenal and really excellent. And I hope that we'll have more time to discuss them more at some point in the future. But Alan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, Gabriel, I just want to thank you very much for your very thought-provoking presentation. I would encourage people, it's going to be posted up on YouTube by Critical Theory, and we'll post it up on our YouTube channel. And I would encourage people to go back and listen to it again. I know I am, and really draw out some of the ideas I think are very critically important in today's situation. Those of you who are coming for the first time to our session, please sign up at icssmarks.org. You can sign up to our email notification list. We have Radhika Desai next week on neoliberalism. We have Paul Liam on Korea, which, by the way, Paul is one of the few people who has direct contact, is very plugged into the what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, has visited North Korea 3 times in recent decades. So those of you who are interested in that issue, please come for that. I want to thank you. Go to our website, contact us, make a contribution to support our activities. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and end the session. Again, I want to thank you, Gabriel, for an outstanding session. Thank you very much. We're going to have you back again.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure, and I look forward to collaborating again in the future.
And we managed to pull off this dual programming, which I think is a good sign for the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody
Okay.
who joined. I think we're
Thanks,
going to shut
Gabriel.
down the stream now. Thank you.
Thank you,
Gabriel.
everybody. Thanks for your questions. Thanks to the participants
y'all.
too. Excellent.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.